spring of 1948, my parents announced to my brother and me that we would be leaving our home in Cleveland and moving to an old Amish farmhouse in a little town called Mesopotamia. The house had no running water. We'd be cooking over a wood stove, pumping our water out of the hand pump next to the sink, and playing games by kerosene lantern at night. By this point in their lives, my folks had already been through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the crash of '29. They'd lost 3 of their 4 parents, and their first baby, a boy, had died. My mother was determined that the narrow strip of grass between the 2 buildings outside our home was not going to be where she was going to rear her children. She was going to rear them in the country, away from the ever-watchful eyes of neighbors and landlords. My father continued his job in Cleveland. He would leave our home each morning dressed in his 3-piece suit and his stiffly starched white shirt. In fact, he even wore that 3-piece suit on the weekends, just loosening up enough to put on a comfortable blue shirt instead of the white one. When I was in 4th grade, something different happened in this town. This was a community whose rhythms were very much rooted on the flow of farming. There wasn't anything else going on there. So there was farming, and there were age-old traditions, and that's what dictated the flow of life in Mespo. But in the 4th grade, this woman came. She was a young woman. She came out of Cleveland, and she came to teach the combined 5th and 6th grade in our little 6-room schoolhouse. Her name was Miss M. She wore soft, stylish clothes, a little bit of makeup, pearl earrings, had no calluses on her hands. She was definitely not a country woman. And people weren't sure why she was there. It's kind of, if you couldn't explain something, they really didn't like it. But I thought Miss M was fabulous. I was completely smitten by her. Sometimes on weekends, she offered art classes. I remember one particularly beautiful weekend in October when she took me and 3 or 4 other little girls to Eli Peterson's field right next to his iconically red Ohio barn. And we were going to have a day of painting. I remember wearing my favorite blue corduroy overalls and a red flannel shirt that were covered by a shirt from my father that was going to keep the paint splatters off and hung all the way down to my knees. Well, I had never had an experience like this before. At least I never remembered painting anything except paint by number wastebaskets and trays, which I was allowed to order from the Sears and Roebuck catalog. And I had coloring books and crayons. And I had really excelled at staying within the lines. But here I was faced with a sheet of paper that had been pinned to a board, pots of paints next to me, and Eli Peterson's barn in front of me. And I painted what I thought was just this beautiful red barn. Had blue sky behind and brown field. And Miss M was there, and I could feel her encouragement. She came around and nodded and smiled. And when I sat back, she gave me the feeling that I had really done a good job. She then pointed to a huge pine tree that was off in the field. And she said, "Helen, don't you think that pine tree would look good next to the barn?" So I kind of stopped, and I looked at the tree, and I looked at my picture, and I thought, what is she talking about? I looked again at the tree, and I turned to her and I said, "But Miss M, the tree is not next to the barn." And she said, "Helen, you're the artist. You can put the tree wherever you want it." And my world changed forever. There was a difference between what always had been and what could be. And I was thrilled beyond measure. I raced home to tell my folks this new discovery, believing in my soul that they were going to be as excited as I was. And in hindsight, I really had every reason to believe that they would be excited. There was a day, for example, when I told my dad with great pride that I'd figured out how to put my polo shirt on front waist every single time, and I was going to patent the idea. Well, instead of laughing me off, he agreed with me that this was a very important notion, It would certainly benefit a lot of people, but that I had to understand there was a difference between a discovery and an invention. And I also had to be prepared to spend a fair amount of my allowance money hiring attorneys to help me through the process. And my mother was the kind of person who had always received every single crushed bouquet of dandelions as if they were treasures, which of course they were meant to be. But that's not what happened that day, and I'll never know exactly what they thought or what they were feeling. But what I saw and what I heard was that I had done something that disappointed them so much. It broke my heart. And they were straight-faced, and I heard my father say that you cannot paint that way. That if you're going to paint what you're looking at, you have to paint what you're looking at. Well, fast forward 40 years, the split that happened then had really cemented itself. It took just a second for that flash to happen, but it took a while for it to get successfully buried, but it was. And I went all kinds of different routes, took academic courses of physics and math and astronomy just to show my dad that a girl could really think and that I could understand science as well as my brother. And then I finally found my way into mental health, where my talents were much more appropriately used. And I got a degree in social work and ended up with my own private psychotherapy practice, which I loved. But something was wrong. I was happily married, everything seemed good, but there was this emptiness and this sorrow, I guess, that I was carrying around. So of course, as a therapist, I went into therapy and I presented the therapist with a couple of dreams which had been troubling me and plaguing me. One was that I was in the city in New York in an area of lofts, and I saw all kinds of artists going into the lofts, then I could not access them. And the other one was that I had discovered that I had a twin, and she had been living all this time in the basement in our farmhouse in Ohio. She was healthy, she hadn't gotten a year older, but she couldn't get out, and it was my responsibility to free her, and I had no idea how to do it. Both dreams left me in such despair. And of course, at this point, they seemed completely obvious, but they didn't seem obvious to me at the time. And as that art piece, which the little girl represented, and of course, which the lofts represented, was gradually liberated, I began buying art supplies, taking art courses, and making art a bigger and bigger part of my life. At one point, I had another significant moment with that therapist when I was bellyaching about not being able to draw a figure as accurately as the figure I was looking at. And she said to me at that point, Helen, there's a difference between visual accuracy and emotional accuracy. And that also kind of gave me permission to go my own route. Still took me quite a while to get there. But the little girl had been liberated. She was with me all the time. But I also am here to tell you that if you liberate a little girl and carry her around with you, she may very well speak up when it might not be the best thing to do. Last summer, my husband and I were enjoying an ice cream late in the afternoon, and the little boy, Noah, who lived next door, came bounding over because Noah loved to show me his artwork. And he stopped dead when he saw us, and he said, Helen, what are you doing? I said, Noah, we're eating an ice cream. He said, you can't eat an ice cream at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You're going to ruin your supper. At which point, my little girl bypassed my executive process, came out my mouth in a kind of smart alecky little girl superior way and said, we're adults, we can do what we want to do. And at that moment on Noah's face, I saw happening to him what had happened to me with Miss M, when the world divided into what was and what could be. So here I am now, 15 years into feeling that I'm a professional artist. My little girl is with me. She prompts me. She drives me. She also sometimes has these little temper tantrums where she's sure that solving a difficult problem with a painting will only happen if I throw the paintbrush all the way across the room. She has days where she feels inexplicably despondent, but she's with me. I have a studio, beautiful studio at AVA. I'm surrounded by artists who prompt me and who feed me, and a staff that does exactly the same thing. I mean, an AVA staff. I can paint my pictures exactly the way I want them. I can move barns and trees wherever I feel they should be, or make my pictures just as emotionally accurate as I want. And I can eat ice cream whenever I wish. Thank you.